The 1980s, very cool decade. I grew up a little bit in the 1980s and the 1990s, and I have very fond memories of the 1980s. And I have very fond appreciation of the sculpture we're looking at. I really think this sculpture uh, is quite a masterpiece from Cuba. We'll be looking at this one again today. And today we're looking at the Volumen Uno exhibit, and we're going to sort of survey the artists who participated in this groundbreaking exhibition by Cubans in the early 1980s. Remember from last class, and maybe prior to that, I mentioned the importance of this quote from Fidel Castro: inside the revolution, everything; outside the revolution, nothing. And he wrote this or said this in response to this challenge of what role do the arts play in a revolution. And I think you can understand how absolutist this quote is in terms of the evolution or in terms of nothing existing outside the revolution, which is to say, nothing counter-revolutionary. And as you know, it's hard to define that quite very clearly. And a lot of the struggle we see with or a lot of the fascination, or what's so fascinating about this period in the 1980s is this dance or this drama of maintaining your art within the revolution and maybe suffering the consequences if it veers outside the revolution. This painting is a sort of it's going to be the crown jewel or the sort of real focus or the recurring theme of this class today. And this is by the artist Antonia Iris, who many of the artists in Los Once or the Volumen Uno group from Cuba identify as a major influence on their work. And I think that's going to be a really important question or thing to remember today is the impact of Antonia Iris on this generation of artists in the 1980s. So let's look at this picture, visually digest it, note the year it was created, 1968, which moves the goalpost a little back, a little further back before what we were looking at. And she really sets the stage, I think, for what the Cuban artists, for the experience of the Cuban artists in the 1970s. And we'll return to this painting. I want to start, though, looking at it briefly so I can hear from you guys any thoughts about this picture and what's going on and how it might relate to Cuba. And remember, this is from the year 1968. So this is still, I'd say, early on in the revolution, within, be less than a decade after the revolution. And I think very much still when the revolution is trying to deepen and clarify its values, its sense of self. So this is the coming of age of the Cuban Revolution, and this is an artist who graduated school just prior to the revolution in 1957, a Cuban artist, and her work chronicles, I think, the sort of early period. And so how does this picture relate to Cuba and or the Cuban Revolution, and or what do you see going on in this picture? And you might consider, what is this picture, could this be controversial at all? So let me hear some thoughts from you guys. Take a moment to think about it. A great first question whenever you're looking at a painting or work of art is not always a great question, but a useful question is there a focal point? Does the artist want us to focus on one thing? So let's start there. Can anyone tell me what do you think the focal point is here?
I think the focal point is like ironically like this absence, because it's like the foreground with this podium, but there's like, because the focal point is this podium, you're expecting someone to be there, and there's no one there. Or at least there's no individual figure. There's this mass of people, but usually when you have a podium, you're expecting one person,
Great.
and that lack of it.
Yeah, always with the formal analysis, the absence of something is also useful. So the absence of movement, or the presence of movement. So the absence of a focal point versus the presence of a focal point. So that's great that you can sort of recognize the artist is intentionally sort of subverting our expectations, or maybe not subverting, but maybe doing something unexpected with a podium. We expect there to be a person there and there isn't. Maggie, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, what if the viewer themselves is the focal point?
Right, the
Because you
person.
have, like, everyone out there in the audience is facing you, and then you're also behind the podium.
Great. That's kind of similar to what Nix just wrote, which is it's like they want you to be the perspective in the perspective of the speaker. So kind of when you remove a focal point, especially when you have a wall of audience in the back, it's like everyone's watching you. Is that what you mean? The viewer, like the viewer is suddenly transformed into like a part of the painting?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'm not even sure if that, I think that goes, that's a very nuanced analysis. And I think that's something to think about as part of perhaps what causes a reaction to this painting. I don't want to give too much away or tell you too much yet. I want you to sort of, it to sort of float around in your head right now without any context. So let me hear more from more people. I think two other people had their hand up. Anyone want to add anything else here? Who might they be expecting? Who might they be waiting to hear from? Who's going to go up to the podium? Someone, average person, famous person. Yeah, the barrier. Aishu points out the barrier. And Aishu, how is the barrier made? Is that painted?
I think it's like some sort of physical objects of sort. I'm not too sure what it is, but it's
Yeah,
interesting that that's the one kind of standout point, and also one of the only few parts on the painting that's actually got color on it, which I think is also an interesting contrast. So yeah.
great, great. Julian, I'll get back to that in a moment. Aishu, Julian.
This is more for just like the overall vibe of the painting, but I think it's really interesting that the figures are black and white, which I think could symbolize like a very clear divide of opinion or perspective, and kind of add to this kind of nervous energy that it puts on the viewer. Uh, Also, just how all of the faces aren't really distinct, but in the mark making that the artist chose to go with, you do see faces.
Great. And I think those faces will be possibly one of the things that generates the reaction that we'll see. Would you say these are flattering? Is this a flattering portrayal of the public at large, Julian?
No, it's definitely from the perspective uh, of like someone who is about to go make a very big speech, in my opinion, and perhaps isn't expecting it to go well. It just has a very nervous, oppressive energy about it.
Yeah, I think I feel that too. It's like a mass of people, and it's you think about how people behave as a group versus how we behave individually, and I wonder if the artist is addressing this idea of people and groups. And this barrier I should mentioned is really notable visually because it is a sort of collage element that the artist has added on, which really visually enriches the painting so much. And you think about what this means, a barrier, velvet rope is the word they use to describe that rope barricades cordoning off the front line, the line in front of a club or an entrance. And so the velvet rope is loaded with connotations of exclusivity. And I think it's notable that the velvet rope is connected to the podium, which feels like it's maybe separating the audience from the people in the back, but also maybe the person who's going to give the speech as a VIP person from everyone else. And I think that audience in the background is so important. It's both in terms of the point of view we have that, yeah, we're looking toward people in the background behind the speaker, or we're on the stage looking out and we're about to give a speech. My personal thought always was that we're looking at the audience behind someone who's going to give a speech, but you guys are helping me see that you could actually be the speaker who's about to give the speech. So it's almost putting you in a position where you could be the equivalent of like Fidel Castro. And what about, how does this relate to Cuba? Anything here does anything stand out as very Cuba? Anything we've seen that resembles this painting? Maybe Fidel Castro giving speeches. I think that would be the biggest point of reference for me here. That this probably, if it's a Cuban artist, this is in the early, in the late 60s. I think it's addressing the idea of someone giving a public address, and probably the likes of Fidel Castro. The PCV says por una paz democrática, and I'm not sure what PCV, if anyone knows what that might be, what that might stand for. It might be illuminating, but I think the more important thing is that, the idea of por una paz democrática, that's really a peaceful democracy, a democratic peace. It's not quite the same as peaceful democracy, a democratic peace. And as you'll see in Cuba, human rights and democracy, those are very loaded words in Cuba, where sort of socialism, according maybe to the Cuban government, implies democracy by definition, or implies participation in peace. And so, and a lot of maybe so a typical Cuban spokesperson for the government might say, well, these attacks about human rights in Cuba are hypocritical, and we'll sort of see how that plays out into the 1980s and 90s, and how these artists have a very privileged role in this context of Cuba and the sort of debates that take place. So we'll revisit this painting. I think we've covered a few of the main visual elements here, so you'll appreciate when we look at this painting in context in a few minutes. So an alternative, or maybe a counterpoint to this painting here, is one by another artist named Soto. And he comes out of this era of the 80s where there's a lot more conceptual art. Oh, thank you. Communist Party of Venezuela. So that's very interesting. I wonder if that's the case here, because this painting's from 1968. I wonder if that's related to, Partido Comunista de Venezolano, I guess, so I wonder if that's what's going on here, if this is from the late 60s. So, something to consider. It might be very well be that, but you got to wonder how that might relate to Cuba. So this artist, and we'll return to that painting in a moment. This artist we're about to see, this one, comes out of this 1980s period when artists shift away from what you see here. And this contrast between these two artists is really the heart and soul of what we're going to go into today. What about Cuban art results in this embrace of conceptual art, as you see here, versus painting like you see here? And I think a lot of that has to do with the controversy this painting generated. And this is one of those stories that I feel like gets overlooked when scholars look at the Cuban Revolution and Cuban art, because they're interviewing a lot of Cuban artists and Cubans, and they're getting a sort of echo chamber. And I think the key omission from this period is this important figure, Antonia Ides, and how she impacts all of these artists who we see today. So we're going to return to her in a moment. And as we look at these artists today, I want you to think about how what happens with her career might have influenced other artists to retreat into conceptual art and/or any kind of art that's deemed safe and/or non-counter-revolutionary. So on the left side, you could appreciate maybe the political, the public, the podium, all these aspects of a society driven by someone giving speeches, and a lot of politics pervading everywhere. And it's not too unlike the picture on the right, which is deeply connected to the idea of the Cuban Revolution and it being a family affair. The whole family is dressed up, very pro-revolution. It's almost kind of, you see it deeply rooting into the family, into the family. And it's an interesting alternative to the painting on the left, because you could see this artist is tackling this family portrait as safe subject matter to address the revolution without it possibly being subject to criticism. And I think that goes a long way in understanding why these artists embrace conceptual art, because it almost by definition defies criticism, partly because you're not visualizing anything other than combining things that leave the viewer to bring their own maybe concepts or symbolism to the work of art. And I'll flesh that out more as we go forward today. So some of the artists that these artists, some of the influence these artists cite from the 1980s who had a big influence on them are people like the artist we saw, Ana Mendieta, who, as you remember, visited Cuba in the early 80s, as I said, sort of a harbinger of things to come. And I want to read this quote by the artist who made the Martí sculpture, and this is by Juan Francisco Padilla, also known as Elso, one of my favorite artists. And he says, quote, "To know Anna was a bombshell for us. It was discovering how the world could see us and how we could become conscious of what we were making. It was really my first contact with someone who sees your production with a different eye, not ruminating within your own relations. In some of us, a more universal, more ambitious capacity in the process of creation was established. We took all the proposals of the revolution, of the guerrilla war, of Che, of all that inspired dreams in the people, and we made it also a goal in our art. It was like appropriating what was ours, and yet we had been looking at it all the time as something put in a book, and that we would have to wait for permission to make ours. It was like an awakening in that sense." So he's connecting on one hand, and showing on one hand that the visit by Ana Mendieta really was something that affirmed their own maybe sense of importance or worthiness, having someone from the outside visit them and participate in this celebration of Cuban identity. Remember, Ana Mendieta was returning to Cuba for the first time on this sort of, I guess, coming of age journey. And this coincides with this coming of age that's happening within Cuba. And Elso is pointing out, too, that these artists do very much believe in their worthiness as people who can be part of the revolution and benefit it and benefit from it. And you really don't feel any sense of betrayal or disillusion from the revolution until, I think, the mid to late 1980s, and especially in the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapses. But some of what we see today, I think, is setting the stage for a controversy or a conflict with the Cuban Revolution. And I think some of what we're going to see today shows these efforts to be within the revolution and to perhaps be relevant in the international community and be worthy as part of the revolution. And you really won't see any effort to be too critical of communism. If anything, I think some of the artists want to be more critical of the particulars of Cuban society, but not necessarily the idea of communism, as it were. That said, these artists are still very isolated from the rest of the world. They live in a Cuba that's very militarized because the United States, remember, during the Bay of Pigs, we invaded Cuba and we worked with the CIA, with Cuban exile groups to blow up one of the Cuban airlines. So Cuba is still very hostile towards outsiders, especially wary of American influence. And so in this context of fear and government kind of control over everything, to a degree, the arts are a refuge, a sanctuary, but the arts are also an opportunity for this new generation to really prove their worth and do things worthy of the legacy of Che Guevara and Jose Marti. Here is Los Once, and you might notice there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So there aren't 11. Where could the 11th be? Well, maybe taking the photograph. Of course, Ana Mendieta wouldn't count as one of the Once, And I'm not sure if who everyone is in the photograph, and it looks like maybe the two women in the middle might be friends and or maybe acquaintances. So one of the great research questions I think you guys could consider asking some of the artists, if you choose one of the ones today, is who the heck is each person in the photo? Can you help us identify the people and who are these others? I love the idea that maybe they photobombed this group photo, or maybe this group photo is sort of assumed to be Los Once, but obviously there's only 9 of them here. So that's one question to consider, is maybe how can we better identify all the people in this photo, and who are the two women in the middle? And we'll see there actually are more women involved in this sort of in the 1990s generation of Cuba. And as we'll see in a moment, Antonia Iris plays a key source of inspiration for these artists of Los Once. In this picture, we're sort of more focusing on Ana Mendieta and her important influence on this group, affirming what they're doing in Cuba. And another key influence these artists cite, apart from Ana Mendieta, is Raul Martinez. We saw a lot of his work, so we need not revisit him in depth, except so much as to point out his very Rauschenberg or Jasper Johns-like influence on his work. And I think his work, this for me feels very much like the Jasper Johns abstract expressionist American style applied to Cuba and to address Cuban subject matter. And it feels like a foreign style used to address Cuban subject matter. This feels more like a Cuban style addressing an obvious Cuban icon, Jose Marti. But I don't think these Cuban artists that we're going to look at today, I don't think they want to paint Jose Marti. I don't think they want to do this, although we do see Jose Marti. I think they want to reinvent, they want to contribute and add their own mark to this legacy that you see by the likes of Raul Martinez. And the third influence that they'll cite as major Cuban influences on their career is Antonia Iris, whose work we're going to look at today or right now. And here you can see her in this picture. And she graduates from the art school in Havana in 1957, right before the revolution. So her career, the timing of her career is very interesting compared to the ones we're looking at now, because she wasn't trained under the revolution. She was trained right before the revolution. So her career is sort of like right after Wilfredo Lamb, but also before the ones we're going to see today. And I think you'll agree that her artwork is really wonderful. So when people think about Cuban art, they often might, or I think a lot of art, the expectations we have of Cuban art is for it to look Cuban or to have some reference to the revolution. And this expectation comes apart from the other expectations, which is it needs to operate within the revolution and or be relevant to the world at large, while also maintaining some unique Cuba flavor. So how does this painting fit into that? This is from 1963, so very early on in the revolution. What would you say about this painting? Any thoughts on this painting? Do you like this painting? Does it address anything? Could this be something that is revolutionary or counter-revolutionary? How do you think the Cuban Revolution perceives something like this? Or what might be something the Cuban Revolution finds counter-revolutionary about this style? Yes, Maggie.
It's just really stylized.
Yeah, definitely not observation more so much. What do you say? Is it stylized? It kind of like is it pretty and manicured stylized?
No, it's not sloppy, but it's not neat.
Yeah, and I think that question of kind of sloppiness, neatness is such a fascinating one, because when you think about what is acceptable art in a Cuban revolutionary context, we've already looked at Zaida del Rio, the painting of her by Garciandia, the hyper-realist, photorealist painting. And a lot of you notice that the style itself stands out like a sore thumb, and or that the painting doesn't have anything overtly Cuban about it. And just the fact that it doesn't have anything overtly Cuban makes it perhaps feel, or maybe led to some feeling, that it was counter-revolutionary. And so that's one little box. Another box might be, well, is the painting executed in a way that feels revolutionary, and what might be counter-revolutionary about a painting? And it could be that, well, your style of painting is quote unquote stylized and or expressive and or sloppy and or not tidy. And I think, you know, the non-tidiness or the almost grotesque quality of it is totally intentional. You could see her wiping away the paint on the face on the far right. And it's really this wonderful, personally expressive style that I can understand why this might be upsetting in a context where you know, everything's in the revolution, nothing outside the revolution, and something that's so disorderly or so has such a kind of expressive quality is so hyper personalized. And yeah, I don't think this itself is going to be upsetting, but I think you can start understanding why her work might meet some critical reaction from the government. Someone says it doesn't honor specifically the revolutionaries of sort. Yeah, it focuses on identity, culture, expression, exploration of color. It's not traditionally pretty. Yeah, and it's really wonderful. And there's something totally not Cuban about it, and yet there's something. What might be Cuban about this, Julian? Is there anything that could she be addressing Cuba in a way that, like, if let's say these are, you know, Cubans, you know, my friends, I don't think we're meant to assume that this is unflattering, but maybe if you're a member of the Cuban Communist Party, you might look at this and say, this is any unflattering portrayal of Cubans is an unflattering portrayal of Cuba, and therefore an unflattering portrayal of the revolution. And that might be, and of course, all of that just betrays the fact that whoever's saying that this is unflattering as very a two-dimensional view of art. I think, though, that's the problem with any politicization of art, is you're going to always suffer from having to navigate around the two-dimensionality of the sort of the way the government sees, because the government will never have a nuanced view of art. I think it's up to the art world or the artist or the individual whenever we're talking about art from a sort of collective. And you could see that with any controversial work of art where I think recently a big sculpture of arms, two people hugging, was created. A lot of people were upset because it looked weird from certain angles. And so you have to sort of deal with the group think when it comes to art, and then how we think individually about art, and those are very different. I love this painting. I really find it masterful and gruesome and wonderfully personal. Dana, yes.
I was just gonna say, I think the thing I find really interesting about this piece as like expressionism is that, oh, you could art. It's interesting to me because usually when you think of an expressionist piece, if there is a figure, it's usually at least from an American understanding of expressionism, it's usually there's a sole figure alone, typically, in this kind of style of expressionism, if there is a figure. But in this one, there's multiple figures, and their faces are like so tightly packed together that you're sort of seeing them as one whole, like if they're like collectively the figure point, which I find really interesting, because while you could totally understand how the style may be seen as counter-revolutionary, I guess there's also an argument to be made here that this is like celebrating the joint community of what it means to be Cuban, which in a way could be pro-revolutionary.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, like, I think it's interesting that you could interpret this so strongly as for one or the other. And I don't know a whole lot about Antonia, but I do know that she like won an award from the Cuban government for like contributing to Cuban culture. So I just find that interesting, because I also know that they've been critical of her work. So I was just like, I find it kind of interesting, like that duality to her art is sort of like present in the work itself and in the history of her as an artist.
Yeah,
Sorry.
so those points you made are wonderful about American abstract expressionists aren't usually individualizing the subject. I'm thinking of like Willem de Kooning's Woman, famous abstract picture of a woman, very similar kind of unflattering or the unexpected, not non-traditional prettiness, but one subject. And I think that's a great point, that having these three figures together, kind of smashed together, could imply a sense of community. And you're not isolating the individual as a sort of focus, rather the collective. And I think that's very right on. And I also like what you said about it. It could be interpreted either way. And maybe goes a little ways in explaining the controversy, because like you said, she does receive awards from the Cuban government, but that's only, as we'll see in a moment, after she retires early because of some of the controversy surrounding.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That was what I was trying to say, is like she got both criticism and praise from the
Right.
government,
So
which I find interesting.
Yeah, she got us slapped away, and then they gave her a cookie. So that is a really good point also, what you made about it could be interpreted either way. And that could be, if you're not clearly on one side or the other, if you're offering any ambivalence, that could be even more counter-revolutionary, the idea of ambivalence. They have to be clearly black or white. So these are things to consider. And remember, I started this lecture talking about the importance of Antonia Itis and what happens to her as something that could, and I'd say could because I can't say this definitively, but could have led a lot of these artists to embrace conceptual art and or abandon painting for at least one generation. I think painting, you'll see, rears its head again in the 90s. I think, though, it somewhat disappears in the 1980s by comparison compared to the 90s, perhaps because of Antonia Itis. So remember some of the things you said, the very expressive quality of her work here, focusing on several figures. Perhaps it's ambivalent about the revolution. And let's see a little bit more of her work. So here's another great example. The Annunciation is a famous subject from religious Catholic paintings about the angel, I think it's Gabriel, visiting the Virgin Mary and informing her, announcing to her that she's pregnant. So presumably that the night before God visited her, and there's some kind of spiritual insemination that takes place. So this painting captures a moment when Gabriel tells the Virgin Mary, and notably she looks very un-Virgin Mary-like. Again, the figures treated with the same kind of non-traditional naturalism that we might come to expect from painting. And so the idea of tackling a Catholic subject here during the 1960s is, I think, something that is certainly not immediately revolutionary, communist for that matter. And the idea of portraying them in this way is also very interesting. It looks like a Basquiat painting before Basquiat. I see the crown, and in a way, I think Antonia Itis does Basquiat better than Basquiat several decades before Basquiat. And this painting likewise could have been controversial because of the subject matter. I think less so because of the way it's painted, because there's nothing Cuban revolutionary about this Catholic subject. But definitely, I would assume that any religious painting would be not a no-no in a communist government that's devoutly atheist, as in doesn't believe in any religion, outlaws religion. And I think you'll see in the 1980s, a lot of the artists retreat into safe subject matter like Santeria or Afro-Cuban religion, perhaps because that's safer than addressing political issues like we'll see Antonia Itis address in a moment. So you can see her style really consistent, these figures, very kind of maybe Philip Guston-like, not, but intentionally kind of maybe cartoonish, maybe halfway between expression and cartoon. It looks almost like Jose Marti there in the middle. What could be possibly controversial about this one? This is 1966. I think the title perhaps could go a little ways in helping capture any explain any controversy. I'm not saying there was any controversy here, but I think we're seeing her career is building up to this early retirement. And there's something, I think, consistently perhaps unflattering about her portrayal of Cubans, even in the sense that there's nothing recognizably Cuban. So she's not, pandering to the Cuban government by giving, stars and Cuban flags or Jose Marti. She's also not celebrating the everyday Cuban life like we saw even in some of the costumbrista paintings like by Landaluz in the 1800s. This isn't like your costumbrista style of painting. Any comments from anyone about this? Would you say this is something that the Cuban Revolution might find untidy and maybe less acceptable? It depends on how you have to think about what are the parameters of the Cuban Revolution. One, it can't be outside the revolution. It probably has to flatter. It can't be too negative about the Cuban Revolution. It maybe portraying the average Cuban in a unflattering way might be understood as counter-revolutionary. One thing to consider is when you live in a society where and maybe anything you do is possibly subject to scrutiny, apart from your own self-censorship and apart from any direct censorship by the government, there's a much more important aspects of censorship, which is all the other people, maybe an opportunistic Cuban with a political axe to grind and maybe noting an opportunity might criticize an artist as a way to advance their own sort of gain some cultural clout by just the equivalent of canceling someone. And I think there's legitimate and really fitting reasons to cancel people. And then we've all seen there's also other cases where maybe we're all being too critical and too maybe too kind of looking for an excuse to ruin someone's life. And I think that's not too unlike a situation where you have so much scrutiny that what happens with someone like Antonia Itis is the paintings she does maybe start, maybe an opportunistic critic sees an opportunity to criticize her, to elevate their own status at the expense of her status. So let's see how that plays out with her work. And, here, I think you could see maybe some of the beginnings of this conceptual Cuban art. I love this so much. This is such a wonderful work of art. So wonderful. Let's take a moment to just look at it, appreciate it. What do you like about this or dislike? What do you think is going on here? Any meaning to this painting? Anything particularly Cuban about it? You'll notice when we get the 90s, this feels like it's almost like a work of art from Cuba from the 1990s. And I think this is the kind of stuff that maybe these Cuban artists after Itis embrace as a more safe subject, more safe style than some of her paintings that we've seen and we'll see. What do you think about this work of art? What are we looking at here? The title of the newspaper might be important, right? That would be something to want to explore. Looks like a kid in a box, maybe with 2 wheels missing. It could be like a portrait of Cuba. Could just be a bunch of found objects that she put into a box to shape like a kid. Something really wonderful and mysterious about it, and something seemingly apolitical about it. And I think that is something important to consider, how something like this, like I said early in the lecture, that something like this might be safer than something like this, because there's something about painting where you're maybe competing with the government for this sort of monopoly over the output of imagery, in the same way that the Catholic Church had sort of monopoly on imagery. And as soon as you allow painters to sign their names or to put themselves in a painting, you've sort of let the cat out of the bag, the genie's out of the bottle. Whereas something like this feels like it's safer from controversy because all you're doing is collecting objects that have already been sort of preordained, or already recognizable, or just part of the sort of environment in which Cubans live, that when you collect them all together and put them together and assembly them, it's like you still have, it preserves the safety of all the individual elements, and it feels safe as an amalgamation of those individual parts. So I wonder personally if the rise of conceptual art in the 1980s is in response to what we see in a moment with Iris retiring, but a lot of the Cuban artists recognizing that this style allows you to question the status quo without getting thrown in jail for questioning the status quo. And that's just something to consider. I don't want to say that in any absolute sense, but something to consider. The contrast between this style and this cannot be more obvious. And here's another example of her painting. And like I said a moment ago, this is for me like Basquiat, but better. I love Basquiat. What I like about this is it's more personally expressive. Basquiat has an expressive quality, but often within the constraints of maybe the Warholian critique of capitalism, or kind of a ironic reference to abstract expressionism. This, like me, almost feels like The Scream or something from the early 1900s, so expressive and like neo-expressionism, so scratchy. And it's so interesting for me to think about something like this compared to abstract expressionism, mainly in terms of how it reads differently given the context of Cuba versus the context of the United States, similar to the way that we receive Warholian Marilyn Monroe like imagery differently within capitalism versus repeated Che Guevara's treated with Warholian kind of branding in the context of Cuba. And so something like this in the United States just would feel more like, okay, another wonderful example of expressive art in the United States. Whereas in Cuba, it feels so individualized and so emotional that I could see that being something that people could feel is counter-revolutionary, because it's so kind of primal and raw, and maybe it's kind of, so outside the revolution. It's so personalized, like the emotional landscape within almost kind of willfully, defiantly against any efforts from the outside to have any dominance over it. And, the idea of the government being a source of good influence on people and our influence on our lives versus sort of your world within that exists and operates independently from all that. That could be counter-revolutionary. I love this painting so much. And this is a painting that gets her in a lot of trouble, or at least in a little bit of trouble, which might, and when you think about Cuba, again, I want to remind you, if someone like Antonia Ideas gets a little bit of criticism from someone, we might think of it as, oh, it's not a big deal if this happened in the United States. But if you're in Cuba, it's such a closed circuit, it's such a closed environment, and it's such a small world and a tight-knit group of people that you're really talking, everyone talks to each other. And if one artist faces any kind of pressure from the government, the other artists are going to talk, and it's going to be shared, and it's going to become the new common sense that you don't want to do that, or you might get in trouble doing that. And so we see the beginning of this dance to maintain one's artistry within the revolution. And there's something about this painting which upsets people. So now we can talk a little bit more about this, especially in the context of her other work. So I think Nix was saying earlier that the grotesque qualities, or I might be mistaking who said this, but the grotesque qualities of the faces, I think, might be part of why it looks like an unflattering, especially compared to, individualizing maybe her friends or her neighbors is one thing, but then to render or to portray the average Cuban, the mass of Cuban people listening to a lecture in that same way seems to make her work a little more critical, perhaps, of Cuba at large, of the typical Cuban audience you would expect to spend hours listening to Fidel Castro's speech. So here on the left, you could see it was exhibited, this painting, in 1968. The work was directly attacked at a public meeting. So a public meeting. So this is a bunch of people. And so, the importance of how we think as in a group, and how we have a different way of perhaps behaving and thinking about things as a collective versus individually. So at this public meeting at the Writers and Artists Union by the literary critic Jose Antonio Portuondo and the union's vice president, he considered the work to be grotesque and defeatist, in essence, counter-revolutionary. And it says, the painting's populous crowd is transformed by the painter into a common herd, a mob of grotesqueries, to be manipulated by the speaker to do his bidding. The empty and awaiting podium makes the absence of the demagogue a powerful presence in reverse. So kind of similar to what Maggie was saying about, the absent speaker. So what do you think? Is that what she was going for in this painting? Could you read this as a grotesque mob to be manipulated by the speaker to do his or her bidding? Is that something the artist could be going for here? What do you think?
Personally, I don't think it was that like malicious from how I interpret the piece. I feel like she's not making them grotesque in a negative way. I think that's just her way of like expressing emotion is through that style. And she does it with like it's the same style she used it for like mi compadres. So I'm like, clearly, I don't think like it's supposed to be I don't think it's supposed to be like that it's critical or hateful. I think that's just how she expresses emotion through her work. And I think because the fact that the title of the piece is a platform for democratic peace, I think is more, well, I guess it could be critical. Like she's like calling upon the leaders of Cuba to maybe not be so militarized, to maybe for the sake of the masses do like be less hostile to the rest of the world, maybe engage more openly. So I guess it could be counter-revolutionary, but I don't think it's like as hostile as being like the Cuban people are a bunch of sheeple. Like I don't think it's that hateful.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but I tend to agree with you, and so it makes me think that this person, Jose Antonio Portuondo, and who knows, we weren't there. I'd have to look more into it to say definitively. My instinct tells me he's being opportunistic and he could raise his hand and say, I criticize that. In the same way, we all know we've seen this controversy before with other artists. Someone with can advance their career by taking down someone else. And I don't know if that was this person's goal. He's the vice president so that's pretty high up. But it does make me sad to think that, you have an environment where someone could really criticize this, and unless someone like Dena stands up and says, hey, wait, no, I don't think this is a negative portrayal of the Cuban people, because I see the faces as just sort of a blurry part of how far away we are from, so you're not individualizing them because it is a group, and groups are all about sort of groups. And I'd like the point that someone made about the black and white. That's something I'd want to think about more, because the artist made a point to differentiate at least the color, and so either could correspond to maybe two different points of view, two different very stark contrasting opinions, or maybe it's referring to maybe the racial demographics of Cuba. I think it's probably more symbolic than that, maybe more political persuasion. Maybe you have to persuade, these are the people you have to persuade to your point of view. I mean, the microphones are all black or darker colors, so you could say maybe that connects to the darker colors out in the audience. You have to persuade the people who are white, as far as different than the other group, a different point of view. But I think it's open to many different interpretations, and this one guy's interpretation seemed to be just one. But it's so extremely kind of, he said defeatist. It's so defeatist. It's just, I would need a little bit of visual evidence to support that fascinating formal analysis, and what's missing here is the evidence to persuade me to that guy's point. And this painting, because of perhaps that controversy, that criticism we just saw, is what forces her into an early retirement. This takes place prior to her receiving an award in the late 80s. And I think her receiving that award goes to show that the Cuban government recognizes that it made a mistake. It's for me, it's too little, too late. So you see here, Iris depicted the most dramatic and grotesque situations of the human condition which caused her work. And this is, I'm quoting from the Cuban database, which I believe is created by the Cuban government, people working with the Cuban government. I'm not totally sure about that. But either way, I think the quote goes a long way into downplaying the role of the Cuban government into forcing her into an early retirement. And even just that, I mean, you can't really sort of, it's hard, it's despite their effort to downplay that, you really can't. So let me repeat the quote. Iris depicted the most dramatic and grotesque situations of human condition, which caused her work to be misunderstood by the revolutionary government, leading to her early retirement. Now that's kind of like saying, you know, John F. Kennedy was, or let me think of another example. Yeah, Martin Luther King was misunderstood by, you know, or maybe Jesus Christ was misunderstood. It's like, well, you know, there's this thing that happened, which was this person was forced into an early retirement. So to say that the government misunderstood, and that's what led to someone's career basically stopping, that's a very, such a self-forgiving way of, or a very forgiving attitude towards the Cuban government, which seems to have, if not overtly or just deliberately made her retire, it seems like she was pressured. And she does continue to make art, but it's more like art that she makes. She opens up her house to children, and they do a lot of ceramics and paper mache, maybe not ceramic, just paper mache. And so she's still alive and she's still contributing to the art scene to a degree, but not like she was in the late 60s. So in the 1970s, I think that's really when you see a lot of artists kind of understand, and I don't just mean the artists, I mean the instructors at the art school probably are telling their students, nah, you don't want to do pictures of people, you know, with this grotesque faces and big groups that portray the Cuban audience this way. But you probably also wouldn't need to say that outright. People would know, okay, that's a no-fly zone, don't do that. And these are the kinds of questions that are so interesting that a lot of researchers don't ask. A lot of researchers, like the people who wrote the books that we have, because on one hand, you don't want to lose your visa to Cuba. The Cuban government might read your research and decide that you're not pro-revolutionary, but also because the Cubans you talk to might not be willing to say, oh yeah, Iris totally got a shitty deal from the Cuban government, and it's horrible that they ended her career early. Just saying that might get you into trouble, right? I think you have to understand that that's very possible that being too honest might lead you to getting in trouble, especially in the age of, you know, media and people sharing what you say in public. So in 1989, she's awarded the Felix Varela Order by the Cuba's Council of State, celebrating her work, and they put on this exhibit of her work. But I think at that point, it's just sort of, she's missed a whole like 2 decades of career. She really didn't do much work in the 70s, and in the 80s, it sounds like that's when the Cuban government finally begins to rectify this situation. So this might be a wonderful person to research, even if she's not alive. It would contribute greatly to Cuban scholarship to ask any of these other artists we see today, you know, what was Antonia Iris's impact on the Cuban art scene? And even as a way to ask, you know, can people be fully honest about this? And do you feel comfortable fully engaging on this subject? Because perhaps it's still like the third rail. Perhaps you still can't be too critical of the Cuban government. I think today it's you have an opportunity where you can really fill in the blanks here. But I think the real unspoken part of the story is the impact of Antonia Iris, both her talent and her positive influence on these artists, but also on how these artists understand that you might not want to paint pictures like this, or you might have to go into early retirement, which is, you can't overstate the tragedy of being forced into early retirement, and how that will send a ripple effect to the rest of the Cuban art community on about, you know, what's within the revolution and what isn't. So these are some things to think about, the lessons learned from her ordeal, what's safe subject matter. And it's not just the subject matter, but perhaps painting itself and the idea of expressionistic painting gets lost for a decade as Cuban artists sort of retreat into more concept art because perhaps it's safer than painting, which the government has a monopoly over image making, especially in the form of Cuban poster art. So that's something to consider. I'm not going to say that's definitively the case, but it helps me understand why you see the shift away from painting to more conceptual art in the 1980s. Even Garciandia, whose work we saw, shifts away from this photorealism towards something more concept art. So let's take a brief look at his work, and then we'll have a break, and then we'll look at more artists from the 1980s and the Volumen Uno. So this whole period reached a zenith with the Havana Biennial in 1984. So the Volumen Uno exhibit takes place in 1981, and the first biennial in Havana is in 1984. And around the world, the biennial in Havana is really well regarded as an alternative, a third world alternative to the first world biennials held in places like Venice. I'm sure you guys have heard of the Venice Biennial. So this is a great example of maybe the non-aligned nations, the rogue nations of the world, or just the artists of the third world having a platform upon which to share their artwork with the rest of the world, and a platform that is very much in the third world. And Cuba has a real sense of clout, being the sort of standing up to the United States. And that's for better or for worse, because on one hand, a lot of people are right to support Cuba against the United States because of the legacy of Yankee imperialism, but also, there has to be a room for criticism of the Cuban government that doesn't depend on sort of going back to deflecting to the United States and blaming the United States perhaps for everything, though that might be valid. I think it's just something to consider. There's many layers of complexity. So night and day, right? The art that Garciandia shifts to in the 1980s, no more photorealism. And I don't think that necessarily is because of the controversy, but perhaps it's related again to Antoniaitis, and just, why risk painting subjects that are controversial when you can make stuff that rests on the baggage we bring with it or to it, because it's already a sort of culturally recognizable artifact, in the way like Andy Warhol or Rauschenberg finds treasure in people's trash or in kitsch, or reinventing like the Brillo pad or the Campbell soup can. I think these paintings here, or these kind of combines or collage sculptures, which you see in the back here, are examples of this kind of emerging conceptual art, and that either addresses everyday items or comes up with sort of very unique, individualized iconography. The knife itself is a sort of focal point, very individualized iconography, but also the memory of childhood and drawing from childhood as a safe source of inspiration. Now, his work, I think you see the influence of Frank Stella, the American artist. Ironically, Frank Stella is the one who paid the bond so that Carl Andre could get out of jail after allegedly, or possibly maybe having murdered Ana Mendieta. So it's irony that Frank Stella influences some of these Cuban artists. And I think you could see that influence here. What do we see in this painting? This is so you see Garciandia goes from, early 80s, and we see a big shift by the late 1980s into work that I think is a little more, the artists start getting a little more critical. They get their confidence back. I think the fact that there's many artists working together makes it a little safer for them to work on art, whereas Antoniaitis was probably very much more of individual, isolated, and therefore subject to more of a target, more vulnerable, more exposed than these artists. So what do you see here? Anything resemble anything we've seen before? Anything notable here? Anything visually recognizable? I think you see some swans. So almost a reference to these paper swans here, but more in silhouette forms. But there's more than just swans here. What else do you see in this painting? Anyone? Anyone recognize anything? There's one thing on the left that you should maybe recognize. You see what I'm talking about? I got a chat there. Let's see. Sugarcane, that's good. Yeah, maybe it looks, yeah, it could be like sugarcane. I like that idea. Maybe a combination of some vegetable organic elements. I see a lily and maybe sugarcane. So we're kind of in this tropical-ish environment, you know, palm frond. And yeah, the hammer and sickle. And some of you might know from communism or from the Soviet flag. I don't even know. The Russian flag doesn't have it on it anymore. The hammer and the sickle would be symbol of the proletariat, the workers, farmers, and industrial workers. The hammer, a symbol of industrial production, and the sickle is a symbol of working on the farm and harvesting. I think the sickle is a tool used for harvesting wheat. So using the hammer and sickle is absolutely a politically charged symbol. What's the artist doing with the hammer and sickle, Nix or Julian? He's kind of, you know, combining it with some of this other like silhouette. I don't know if you know Kira Walker's work. She does a lot of work with silhouettes and black and white, literally addressing race, history, and the environment. Yeah, and meshing it with the environment. Julian said, and that, yeah, that's a great point. Sort of blurring the outlines into one. And this one here, it's a little. There's some other stuff going on here. Here I see the hammer and sickle, the vegetation, the sugarcane, and maybe lilies or some kind of tropical environment combining with swans and the layers of atmospheric, kind of a sense of atmosphere and depth. But no real one focal point, perhaps, except maybe the swan-like flamingo head sticking out in front. But the fact that there's no details definitely leaves it in kind of a dreamy-like quality. What's going on here? I think getting a little more on the controversial side here. What are you seeing here that, and after this, we'll take a short break. What do you see going on in this painting? This is also by Garciandia. Anyone take a stab at this one? I see some kind of copulation, some kind of, oh, maybe someone's beat me to the punch. Yeah, wolf like animals. Yeah, am I wrong? I see two like some kind of, you know, sexual act going on, and it looks like maybe even like some sexual act between some shapes that almost have some reference to some of the other shapes we saw before. You know, one figure bent over, another behind them, maybe penetrating them. So, and I could be wrong. I think I'm right. I see two different figures similarly engaged in a similar act of some kind of copulation. So I don't know if this caused controversy, but I think you can see these artists as they reach the later 80s. Yeah, comparing people to animals. Yeah, certainly. You know, because it's black and white, because it's silhouette, because you don't have those details, it tends to neutralize any of the salacious quality of two figures fornicating, and or it neutralizes it by being so abstracted. And yet I think this kind of thing, especially if you think of the fact that these might be hammers and sickles, you know, if you have a hammer and sickle transforming into a person making love to another person, especially if it's, you know, implied homosexual love, I think that's the kind of thing that will eventually cause some kind of get the government very interested in your work. And I think that very well could have been the case, but we don't know for sure because Garciandia moved to Mexico. So what I think you'll find, and we'll pick up on this as when we return from the break, what's so fascinating about this time period is even though there's all these expectations about these artists being the first generation of artists celebrating and benefiting from and showing the world all the benefits of the revolution, the Cuban Revolution, all these artists leave Cuba by the late 80s, early 90s. I think mainly because they see greater opportunities outside of Cuba, which is a double-edged sword, as we'll see in a moment, but also they want to have, you know, be able to leave and explore the world and maybe develop as artists and go places with their art and maybe evolve as artists in response to all the influence of places they go. So this first generation of artists, most of them, if not all of them, leave Cuba. And when I say leave Cuba, I mean leave permanently. And as we discussed last class, this will have a big impact on some of their careers, because once you leave Cuba, you lose a lot of that cachet that comes with being a Cuban artist, and that becomes very important as a sort of another parameter influencing Cuban artists. As we see in the 90s, Cuban artists are much less likely to leave Cuba because they understand that if you leave Cuba, you lose a lot of the value of being a Cuban artist. So let's take a break and we'll pick up on this, on these other artists of Volumen Uno in, let's say 10 minutes. It's like a 10-minute break. So I'll see you guys back at 10 o'clock. Here we're looking at Garciandia's work from the late 80s, and I'm pointing out that the artist combining the hammer and sickle with sexual imagery, and that's probably not as incendiary as combining the Cuban flag with sexual imagery. Of course, it's a little different when you think about the Cuban flag. It's loaded with nationalism and history, whereas the hammer and sickle is more of a specifically communist symbol, maybe Soviet Union symbol. Perhaps that was safer to mutilate or transform and combine with sexual imagery. I still think that kind of thing is pushing those boundaries, is something that might help explain why Garciandia decided to move to to Mexico City. And we'll see this is a very common theme. And it goes back to what I talked about last class, which is, and this is an artist from the 1990s, a little later on, Tonel, saying that, observing that the Cuban avant-garde of the 1980s burned their boats, which is a reference back to Cortez forcing the other Spanish in his group during the conquest, forcing the other Spaniards to continue on his march to Tenochtitlan and conquering the Aztecs. And he burned their boats. Cortez burned their boats to force them, to compel them to continue with him. So in this case, Tonel is referring to the idea that the Cuban artists burned their boats by leaving Cuba. And once they left Cuba, they could no longer go back to Cuba. And that's both metaphorical and literal. The literal is geographical. The metaphorical is they lose some of that clout of being a Cuban artist. So moving ahead, let's see some more of these Cuban artists who are involved in Los Once. And even though the works of art we're going to see aren't necessarily what were in fact exhibited in the Los Once exhibit, I'm sorry, the Volumen Uno exhibit in 1981, you can still see how their art fits into this bigger, greater context of art in the 1980s after Antonia-itis. And I really encourage you to think about how their art relates to the experience, the ordeal of Antonia-itis, which we just went over. So here's Jose Bedia, probably well known around Miami. Very much example of someone who retreats into Santeria or embraces Santeria as a guiding source of inspiration for his artwork. And I'm not sure which one is Jose Bedia in this picture. I am using some inferences, deductive reasoning to conclude it might be him on the far left, but that's something I'd like to figure out for sure. Who's everyone in this photo? And that wouldn't be too hard to find out from contacting any of these artists. And this would really help a lot, just to know something as basic as can you name everyone in this photo? And that would help, scholarship and other researchers to advance that ball a little further ahead. So here's some of Joe Bedia's work, and I think you can appreciate, I call him Joe because I think in Miami he's known as Joe Bedia, but Jose Bedia, and you can appreciate there's something really surreal and magical and really individually wonderful about his work that has one foot in the Wilfredo Lam legacy with Santeria and this sort of quirky iconography. I think this sort of very black figure reminds me a lot of the figures we saw by Wilfredo Lam, and updating it more for this sort of 1980s with this sort of mixed media installation But I do wonder if he settled on Santeria subject matter, perhaps because, if you're going to paint, you don't want to paint pictures of people at a podium with a bunch of Cubans in the background. You're much safer painting subjects that are kind of Afro-Cuban because it celebrates Cuban identity without perhaps upsetting the government because you're focusing so much on the sort of the religion quality so much as the cultural contribution aspect of Santeria. But of course, that's a fascinating question too to consider. Sort of what did the Cuban government, what were the rules about practicing Santeria and Afro-Cuban religions versus Catholicism? Because as we know, communism and religion are not happy bedfellows. They don't coexist very well. And you have to, that's something to consider if you want to research some of these artists, is maybe ask about whether Santeria or Afro-Cuban religion was a safe subject, or if there were, if they had to navigate carefully around anything related to religion in the context of a communist society. Either way, I love his painting. I love his it's so simple and effective. These dots, his vinculo in azul is links in blue. So, linking together these spots into one cohesive whole. And these flourishes he adds are so simple in their execution, but so effective in capturing this almost spiritual quality, the luminosity with this forest-like environment with that figure. I love his work. I love his painting. It's refreshing. And I think his work benefits from something that's so important as I've looked at a lot of artists, as I study art history, and just as from the point of view of another artist, is the value of imagination. I think it goes so much further than talent or sort of ability, and not to say that those aren't important too, but I think, imagination, perseverance, originality, having a message is something so important, however you choose to define message. But message is up there with imagination, having a wonderfully refreshingly individual way of visualizing the message. And that's what I see here, someone who's not copying anyone else so much as coming up with their own meaningful vocabulary to express themselves while preserving some sense of Cuban quality. There's definitely a reference to the Santeria here, especially, in something like this, but the role of imagination and getting so much from so little here is so important. It almost reminds me of Frida Kahlo. She would freely use writing and calligraphy in her work. And the juxtaposition of writing and painting is always rich. And I think depending on what writing and what painting, it's all the more rich. Let's see some more. So Bedia leaves Cuba in 1993. And he's someone who I think benefits from leaving. And he leaves because he was drafted into the effort in Angola. As you remember, Cuba is very much involved in Angola, the liberation of Angola against the imperialist agenda of South Africa. So he decides to leave the country to avoid the draft, similar to people avoiding the Vietnam War and avoiding the draft here in the United States. And you could see all the different facets going into these artists' decision to leave Cuba. In this case, he wants to avoid the draft. But I think in this case, because he leaves, he, unlike the other artists, he does benefit from having left Cuba. As I said a moment ago, he's very well known in Miami. And if you ever go to Miami, or if you have, you've probably seen his work and don't know it. And his work translates into these different media really wonderfully, whether it's metal sculpture, reja forjada, the ironwork, very kind of synonymous with Spanish colonialism, although here in a more avant-garde Art Deco way. Looks like a church here, stained glass. It's a wonderful example of, I guess you call this using Caribbean iconography or animals. Like this is a manta ray. I think I've been here. I think this is a movie theater in Miami. Almost Picasso-like versatility. Mariposa, a butterfly. Here's a manatee, so a Taino word. So he's definitely translating, although they look almost Cuban stars, translating his work into this sort of Miami vocabulary and doing really well. It looks like he's been quite successful in Miami. And you got to love that his Cuban style is now a permanent part of the environment in Miami. So moving ahead, this is one of my favorite artists. I've mentioned him before. You guys wrote about his work in your midterm. And there's something almost Ana Mendieta-like here. We saw a quote by him a moment ago at the beginning of the lecture about Ana Mendieta. Well, here's a quote about his Jose Marti sculpture. And I think someone in the chat might have said something. Yes, who you've seen his work, Carrie, in Miami? Yes, yeah, I think probably more of his work than ever around Miami, and I think he's someone who might be a little. It's possible he might be a little harder to contact because he might have become Miamified. He's become like a Yankee as sort of the self-importance we all have. Perhaps we might not want to acknowledge it, but we're all busy, and the more famous you get in the United States, the less accessible you become. And that's not the case for everyone. But I think these Cuban artists are very accessible, and I would encourage someone to try to contact someone like Jose Bedia, because he might be thrilled to talk about his life prior to Miami. And he's someone who could really provide a lot of insight without running much risk of controversy in Cuba. So here's a quote by Elso about his Marti sculpture. And let's go a little further ahead so we can maybe appreciate it, or we'll see it in a moment. So he says, when I made the Marti, I thought, why not? Let's give this a shape and a name. In this case, for me, it's like taking that out of the local context and putting it into a broader one that's more Latin American. It will then become something about a myth where there is a creator who will make a world starting from an ethical principle of relations. That is what my understanding of socialism, or better, how I understand my understanding of socialism. And I think what's so cool about that quote is these artists aren't what you might expect, kind of critical or angry at the revolution. They're pro-revolutionary, but perhaps not they don't want to create poster art. They want to make the revolution meaningful through a style that's internationally relevant, that shows the worthiness of these Cuban artists, I think they really are in alignment with the Cuban government in the sense that they all want to benefit each other. And he discovers, I think, a really safe style here, which is in one part a blend of maybe this Afro-Cuban elements we've seen, but also he's broadening his scope to subject matter, making Cuban subject matter more relevant, perhaps, to the rest of Latin America. And how does something like this relate to that? Do you see this as something that likewise expresses a sort of an interest in a greater context and/or socialism? Looks like we have a bird here, bird with his wings spread in flight, and you almost have like a crucifix holding it together. And I don't think you need to nail this down into meaningful words in this case, because something like this almost exists more with greater contentment without us kind of making it so verbal. And it's such a refreshing take on sculpture. It feels so fragile, and yet it feels like elements of Ana Mendieta taking nature, finding inspiration, and now bringing it back into the gallery. And I think you could see this as an example of trying to reinvent artwork. It is something uniquely Cuban, but also keeping it relevant in terms of the international world. It doesn't look like Cuba's importing any style from outside. Rather, it's offering its own unique Cuban style. Here's another quote about the Marti by Elso. With the piece of Marti, I frightened myself. It was a risk I had to run, but also a responsibility. For me, it was a moral, political, and even religious dare. What do you think he means by it was a risk? What do you think is so risky about this sculpture, mixed media sculpture of Jose Marti, the famous leader of or participant or promoter of Cuban independence, who of course died during his fight for independence against the Spanish? What do you think was so risky about this? And boy, isn't it great he took that risk. So maybe as you think about that, here's another quote from your reading from page 67 of the To and From Utopia by Rachel Weisz. It says, Elso had been consistently belittled in official circles. His visions of myth, spirituality, and history apparently too ethereal or inchoate. Inchoate means like unformed for the positivist who had to make decisions about culture for the masses. Until he left for Mexico, he had pretty much kept to himself, absorbed in his work or in conversation with friends. In fact, it was not until he was in the hospital dying of leukemia that he began to seem important. So this sculpture itself became a symbol of the biennial by the international press. And so you see this tension between the international world and fully embracing this, and some elements of Cuban society finding some elements of his work, as it said, too ethereal or too inchoate, which to me feels like a similar criticism to that which was levied against Antonia Itis, perhaps, too grotesque, too ethereal, too inchoate. And I think you see that more perhaps with this than perhaps with this. So this could be him reacting to some of this criticism and trying to offer something that's maybe not going to get him in trouble. What do you think? What's the risk he's taking here with Martí? It seemed like it's a little like he might have thought it was a risk without realizing perhaps how benign of a choice it might actually be to he might have thought he's tackling an icon who's so important, and yet I think he just we discover that this icon is almost is so importantly Cuban, and yet he is also importantly Latin American. He's a figure that is international as well as national, and I think that risk really turned out to be a real rewarding choice, because as you can see, it's a masterpiece of kind of suffering in the face of adversity, or just being a revolutionary who's barely, I think a lot of you said this really eloquently in your responses in the midterm, that he's standing wounded, but still standing up tall, facing, fighting. And so this could be interpreted as a symbol of the Cuban Revolution, standing up against the United States. And you could also see it perhaps as someone standing up in the face of any kind of adversity or political persecution. I certainly think you could see this as an artist in Cuba coping with the Cuban communist government and its sort of criticisms. I think a lot of you have spent enough time looking at this where you've got it covered in mud. It's such a wonderful use of concept art. And this could be inspired by Antonia Itis, some of the things we saw from her. It also has a foot in Catholic tradition. This is from the late 1800s, depicting Catholic saints with wood. And the Spanish Baroque goes even further with very glossy faces and very emotional sculptures that look almost human-like. And I think this comes from almost that tradition of Catholicism, treating Jose Marti almost like a Catholic saint. Of course, he's holding a machete in his hand, which is a tool for cutting sugarcane, but also could be seen as a tool for standing up against the Spanish. And it's a wonderful example of concept art, like a lot of his other work. And it sounds like he was criticized. People in Cuba didn't know what to make of him. And he eventually left Cuba, probably perhaps to see treatment for his leukemia. I'm not sure if that's why. I think, though, probably like the other artists, they made some success, they had enough success in Cuba that the door was open for them to leave Cuba, and they just decided to make it a one-way door rather than a two-way revolving door. And someone like Cacho, who you see here, I think he was influenced by Elso's work. I love Elso's work. Sadly, his career is cut short, and yet it translates so wonderfully. It really looks like it should be alongside Ana Mendieta's work, where he's taking nature and making it gallery friendly, like we saw at the very end of Ana Mendieta's career. And I love this. It's really wonderful in that sense of sculpture, but using materials that are really unexpected. And he's such a zest for material and texture. I think you could appreciate that the Cuban Revolution doesn't know how to how this fits in perhaps to the, as it says, too ethereal and inchoate. But I think that's also why this concept art or this sort of sculpture is so much safer than Antonia-itis, because it's hard for the government to really declare that this is counter-revolutionary. Sadly, however, he doesn't make it past 32. He dies in 1988, and you can only imagine what his work might have been like after he graduated, or after, if he had lived longer. And he's someone you can research and ask other artists more about his works to honor his legacy, and that would be a wonderful thing for you guys to ask another Cuban artist. If you're interested in Elso, you might in email or interview some other Cuban artists about him, so we have a greater understanding. Maybe, for instance, why did he go to Mexico, and other questions that might be relevant. So I love his heart. That's so wonderful. I'd like to see more of his work and find out more about him. So a few other artists from this Los Once from the Volumen Uno. I'm not going to get into each one of them so much as to give you a snapshot of their contributions. And we'll see them again, because we'll see how this work relates to other artists in the 90s. One female artist named Amabel Poblet, her work is very similar to this in terms of creating these installations of like meshes of material. And Ricardo Bray kind of reminds me of Elso, really wonderful, refreshing use of juxtaposing safe elements from society. And something like this is actually on display in the Museo de Bellas Artes in Havana. And again, concept art, combining cultural artifacts that are safe, and making art out of these things is almost by definition going to be safe, because well, there's something about concept art in a communist environment that maybe you're drawing from how these objects relate to childhood or just everyday environment. I think it's such a fascinating solution to how do you make art that's not going to get you in trouble. But Ricardo Bray, another one, he leaves Cuba in 1991. You're noticing a theme here. And his art, he's someone who stays in the United States. You can see this wonderful example of his more recent art. But I think you could also see how, as an art collector, it might be much less valuable to collect something like this than it is to collect something that he made in Cuba, or any artwork made in Cuba by artists who are still in Cuba. So something definitely to keep in mind as we move forward, how you don't want to burn your boats, or how these Cuban artists benefit from this important aspect of our interest in their Cubanness, or their revolutionary quality of their art. So one of the most successful artists, probably the most bankable, as in the artist who fetches the most money for his work, maybe along with Jose Bedia, is Tomas Sanchez. And I'm still trying to figure out what's going on. So he won the Biennial Award in 1984 for his painting. So he's someone who's celebrated in Cuba. Although I'll read this brief quote about him in your reading on page 23 about Tomas Sanchez, and it says, a contemporary of the 1970s genuflectors, Sanchez had developed a serious interest in yoga, and his exquisitely rendered landscapes of garbage and puddles reflected an Eastern philosophy preoccupation with the centrality of small truths. Largely scorned at the end of the 1970s and fired from his teaching job at the Escuela Nacional de Arte under accusations of, quote, religious proselytizing, that means converting people to religion, Sanchez was rehabilitated only after winning the Juan Miró International Drawing Award in Barcelona in 1980. His presence in Volumen Uno therefore highlighted the transitional tone of this event. So one thing I'll note is the writer here doesn't put the word rehabilitated in quotes, and I assume that she means that his winning the Juan Miró International Drawing Award, quote unquote, rehabilitated him, as in rehabilitated his career, making him more kind of acceptable to the Cuban government. But that's exactly the kind of thing I'd like to see fleshed out better, that she kind of glosses over. And it sounds like he made some more, like, it sounds like his subject matter shifted into what we see now, from something a little more maybe untidy in the 1970s And he is someone who, very much like Garciandia, had a career in the 70s that transforms in the 80s into what we see here. So he's another artist that definitely sounds like he was followed, pursued by controversy, pursued him, and someone whose story might benefit from us researching a little bit more. Why did he leave Cuba after being so, maybe after receiving some accolades, but also how did the sort of controversy surrounding his interest in things like yoga and religion, how did that contribute to his decision to leave Cuba and or transform his art into what we see here? We're going to see a few examples of his painting now, but you notice there's two figures looking at each other across a river or a pond, and this almost surreal landscape, almost religious quality, like he's transforming a very distinctly Cuban-like landscape into like a pointed Gothic arch. So we've seen some landscapes, and we've seen this picturesque, this use of combining recognizable landmarks or buildings like a sugar factory, a sugar mill, with the beauty of the Cuban landscape. Is that what we're seeing? Do you see any reference to any history of Cuba here, or do you see any reference to the Cuban Revolution, and or how does this surreal treatment of these landscapes, why does he do that? Is that part of him navigating politics? Is this safe subject matter? One thing to consider is the politics of a landscape. And I think it's fascinating to think about that idea that a landscape is safe because depending on how you paint the landscape, but there's something almost, I wonder if what's going on in his work is he's making a point about like almost like it's a conceptual landscape, and he's talking about the landscape, addressing the landscape in terms of it being removed from politics and therefore safe, almost like a low risk, because he's treating the idea of a landscape as something that's kind of by definition not politicized. And we know that from looking at a topographical map versus a political map with there's no political boundaries. You could see this as almost like looking at pictures of cimarrones, the fugitive slaves inhabiting the Cuban landscape in splendid isolation with no stars or red triangles or hammers and sickles anywhere to be seen, no sugar. What do you think? What's your? It feels like I feel almost a Garciandia like quality here, where someone is sort of just in nature, removed from politics. The difference being, while Garciandia was criticized, perhaps because it's so ambivalent politically, these are very celebrated, and these come many decades after, or at least a decade after, and it could be he's sort of trying to get back to painting while avoiding any subject matter that got Antonia Itis in trouble. And to go another step further, it could even be him making a point that the landscape is sort of the exclusively safe subject, because it's so hard to sort of find anything critical, because I mean, what could be more celebrating of Cuba than the landscape itself, especially if you remove any of these sort of recognizable elements of consumerism or capitalism or communism or anything. It's like you're looking at someone like a Walden, like a Thoreau, removed from society and therefore removed from politics. And yet you still have to wonder about this surreal quality. These waterfalls are too tall, these trees are too numerous. The landscape is almost like an imaginary, dreamlike landscape. And that's something to consider as you consider the question of, the political safety of these pictures. This is Cuba. This is a landscape of Cuba. And how could anyone possibly ever find anything at fault with this in terms of political controversy? It's checking all the boxes. And yet that's what I find so interesting. He's checking those boxes almost as a way to subvert the idea of kind of politics. Almost he's saying like, I'm going to be removed. I'm going to be outside the revolution, like almost literally outside the revolution in this landscape, by painting Cuba, but painting Cuba, just the landscape of Cuba. It's really a funny, I don't know if that's what he's going for, but it feels like he's revisiting familiar Cuban subject matter, like the landscape, and revisiting in a way that has one foot in this idea of Cuban identity because it is recognizably Cuban, and yet so far removed from the politics of Cuba that it just makes me wonder if this is another example of like retreating into safe subject matter. And the appeal is pretty self-evident. It's, wonderfully painted, and yet it's not just a landscape. Generally, I find landscapes somewhat boring compared to this, and I still have a hard time completely understanding if I don't know totally, I'm not totally sure about my understanding of what's going on in his work. It resembles Magritte, perhaps the surrealist painter famous for painting the apple covering the person's face. I think you'd agree it has a surreal quality. Like none of these are real places. It's like a cenote or kind of a sinkhole where one shouldn't be, or it's like a surreal sinkhole. You often see this figure, and remember, he talks about yoga, the importance of yoga. So now that I say that, I think you almost can see that he's visualizing a sort of individual in a state of rapture and a state of kind of transcendence. And I think his pictures are maybe transcending the politics of the time. Remember, he was religiously proselytizing people, he was converting people to religion. So he could be an artist who has a very rich, meaningful inner world that's religious in its basis, and he has to keep that hidden away on the inside because as soon as it comes out, it might get him in trouble, which it did. He got fired for proselytizing. So these paintings could be a response to that, kind of painting this rich inner world, externalizing it, but doing so in a way that's safe. And how safer can you get than painting a lush Cuban environment? I can almost feel the Cuban government official like looking at the painting, trying to figure out how to find criticism and just not succeeding because it's as safe as can be. And yet I love the idea that he's subverting that because he's really almost offering like an individualized view of nature that's beautiful and isn't about nationalism or history so much as retreating into nature and finding beauty. And um I don't know, it's yeah, exactly. Dana points out that could be political too. It really depends on how you define political. The famous quote is the personal is political, which is to say there's often an assumption that we differentiate between the personal and the political, and you need not do that. You can easily say that anything you do personally is political. And yeah, I think that's a great way of he's redefining politics here, maybe even empowerment. Maybe redefining the Cuban landscape. That's a political message to say, this this having something that's personally meaningful, that's not meaningful to the communist revolution is sort of a way of maybe expanding your understanding of politics, or maybe understanding the tension in Cuba between that sort of the public display of Cubanism or communism versus these sort of inner world, your inner beliefs about it. And all art is a sort of externalization of your internal thoughts or your internal feelings. So that tension coexists alongside this other layer of tension within Cuba between the inner and the outer world. And is it the government's job to transform you from within in that Che Guevarian sense of the new man, the new Cuban, or is there always a boundary between you and the government, and the government never has a right? And you could look at something like abortion too as something like, keep the government out of that part of my body. And so there's a boundary there. And so, it's up maybe on an individual level to define where that boundary is. Though an ongoing question with all of these artists we're seeing is, the personal and the political, and navigating an art career accordingly. I'd like to know, I don't have the titles I think a lot of these are untitled, but I'd like to know the dates so we could see how his art evolves. There's something almost Alex Gray. I don't know if you know Alex Gray's art, very anatomical drawings of it's almost like Hindu, like combining the anatomy, the blood system, the circulatory, the inner world of the body, and spiritualizing it. And I feel like there's something very spiritual about his artwork. And if you're a spiritual person in Cuba, unless you're spiritual on behalf of the communist revolution, you probably don't want to be sharing too much of that spirituality with people or it might get you in trouble. And that, I think, is what he might be doing here. These quiet moments of peace remind me of, a woman lying in the grass, enjoying whereas this one, just by putting that bird in the picture, now it's more like a landscape. Now, just the bird itself, was it egret, the heron, that changes it. And even though the figure there is on the left, just that one element makes it more of like a landscape and removes it from the surreal. And of course, the rest of this landscape in this case isn't too surreal. But I think you immediately feel the difference between this painting and one like this or one like this, where he has a more surreal element pervading other paintings. Even like this still feels very surreal to me. Something about the way he's portraying nature is too tidy. This could be a real island, but I suspect it isn't. I think he's creating these fantasy environments, and that one figure's relationship, it would be different if there are two figures, and in some cases there are, or three, and they're separated, they're isolated from one another. And I think this picture could very much be a reference to communism, or the idea that your spiritual domain is something that by definition you've isolated from everything else and from everyone else. And you see that in the history of Christianity with Catholicism and Protestantism, especially when the printing press was invented and people could read the Bible rather than needing to go to church to see the pictures to help tell the story of the Bible to the illiterate. And so you might consider in the same way, Cuban artists might have a personal sense of meaning and a rich inner world about the spirit, and that could coexist peacefully with this external communism. And maybe some elements of communism might not want that clear boundary between the inner world and the outer world. But I think you could have them coexist. You don't necessarily need the communism to pervade every part of Cuban life. But again, that's an ongoing theme that we'll continue to look at is the idea of being inside the revolution or outside the revolution. And so the idea is your inner world inside the revolution, or is it inside you? How much of that is sort of accessible to the government? Someone points out, it's interesting because in America, historically, many landscapes get very political with the legacy of colonialism. Yeah. And Manifest Destiny, especially when you think about, owning the landscape. Yeah, so I wonder if it affects Cuban landscape because one thing to remember is a lot of our landscapes early on were an outsider, French lithographers visiting Cuba and exotifying the landscape. So there's an element in Cuban history of treating the landscape as a sort of exotic and not necessarily inhabited by Cubans, right? And then we see depictions of sugar mills, and you don't see the slaves. And then Wilfredo Lam updates our understanding of the Cuban landscape with Cubans in it, with sugarcane. He reclaims sugarcane from this exploitation of sugar production. And you might think about the Cuban landscape as a way of celebrating nationalism in the face of colonialism. So there's two sides of it: the sort of exotic Cuban landscape of cha-cha-cha, and sort of even tourists today go to Cuba primarily to enjoy the beach and the sun, and not necessarily for the culture or for politics. And so there's that side. And then there's also the side of reclaiming the Cuban landscape for Cuba, for Cuban sovereignty. And I think that's what's going on here with him choosing this subject matter, because he knows you can't really criticize this because he's celebrating Cuban identity by just, by capturing the Cuban landscape. And yet I do think he's doing it in a very subversive way. I can't say that definitively, but he's someone who you might consider contacting. He might be hard to contact. He's got a lot of ka-ching, a lot of zeros zeros and commas in his artwork, the sales of his artwork. So he might make a lot of money to the point where he's less accessible. But I would certainly not let that stop you from trying to find out more about him. And you could consider, again, the jungle, how it might fit into this idea of the landscape, reclaiming the landscape from colonialism. That's okay, Karina, welcome back. So some more examples of his work, the figure walking through nature, the cloud, surreal clouds. He's so prolific, and his work is very emotional. Something emotional about water. It has a journey. It's transforming, going from one state here to another. So it's very easy to emotionalize water, more so than trees. Trees have a certain emotional quality to it, but because the water is just individual here versus the collective of the trees. Oh, there you go, right there. See, sometimes this could be political in the sense that the collective is the forest, but the individual is this sort of emotional water. So, that could be a way of framing what's going on in Cuba, the empty podium versus the masses, behind. This could be almost like a reference back to that in a very poetic, kind of almost surreal way. The trees almost represent socialism, whereas you are the individual navigating. And personally, I really love the challenge of a landscape painting, of making it meaningful without it just being a postcard. And I think that might, I love the idea that if you really think about it long enough and kind of open your mind, you'll understand that these are really political paintings masquerading as landscapes. And what about them particularly makes them so is a subject to worthy of greater investigation. Remember, the difference between looking from above down at the landscape positions you in this safe, much more safe point of view versus maybe being on the ground. So that might be another element of safety in these paintings. And the view from above is sort of this godlike point of view versus being standing at the podium looking out at the audience is a much more politically charged point of view and location. So this is as far as you can be from the podium. This is like the guy decided, I'm not going to give that speech. I'm going to, and of course, I'm not saying that this artist had any clear reference to Antonia Iris and her podium painting, but I feel like this is as far as you can get from the podium. Like, see ya, I'm not going to give that speech. I'm going to go back to the safety in the forest where no one can ever question my revolutionary bona fides. So Sanchez nevertheless leaves Cuba in 1990. So another example of someone burning their boats and leaving Cuba. And we'll see two other artists before we wrap up, Leandro Soto. And this is a very important, again, I think you can now understand why this sort of concept piece, and I call it concept because he's taking a family photo and offering it as art, adding some elements, these lights around the side almost resemble a beauty, what you call it, maybe like a place where you get your face made up, waiting for a theatrical production. The writing around the side is almost irreverent. But the idea of using this, a photograph of your sort of family's revolutionary commitment, is another sort of solution to this question of how do you make art that's safe, that's not going to get you into trouble or force you into an early retirement, which is never a good thing after all that time invested in developing your career and your interests. So here's a quote from Soto about this picture. It says, "Because ours is a completely revolutionary family and began with my great-grandparents who fought with Antonio Maceo's troops," that's the independence movement against Spain, "my father, my mother, everybody integral parts of the revolution." And so what I wanted to say with Retablo Familiar, or this painting here, is somewhat to this establishment was, this is not going the way you said it would. You are veering away from the original plan of the revolution. This is not moving in the direction you said it would. So he's clearly trying to say something about the revolution, criticizing it. And how does he do so? Well, by embracing the revolution. And you see that here where he's kind of building on the bona fides. He's building on the fact that his family has a measurable, proven commitment to the revolution. And he's using that as sort of like a way to criticize the revolution as sort of, I'm not saying what he's not telling us exactly what it is about the revolution that's veering away from it, but it could be things like, the political totalitarianism. And yet what's so interesting is sort of these efforts, these strategies to be within the revolution and not attract any political controversy. And I find that so interesting, the idea of drawing from maybe childhood, pre-revolutionary memories, or even like this is like almost holding a mirror up to the revolution saying, look at all of us dressed up, all of us so dressed up, kept almost like Che Guevara, committed to the revolution. we are true believers. Yeah, you can't question us. They're sort of like the extremist Catholics during the Black Plague or the bubonic plague, who were even more devout than the Catholics, and almost take things to more of an extreme. So it's very interesting, these strategies that you see that seem to be avoiding the political controversy that Antonia-itis attracted, and yet they seem to be going back to a more politically combative or confrontational, at least more confrontational subject matter by the late 1980s. And a lot of these individual artists you saw, they had to face some kind of reckoning with, do they, with either proselytizing people or having to go fight in Angola, or maybe getting forced into an early retirement. So that's something to consider if you want to investigate any of these artists more, how they relate to this idea of being within the revolution, making artwork that's safe. And this art fetches, these are just pages from Soto's journals from the 1980s, and each page fetches, $10,000. And it really goes to show how important and recognized these artists are as a sort of new wave of Cuban artists in the early 1980s. I see a reference here maybe to Diego Rivera, and that wouldn't surprise me if they're going to Mexico. Mexico and the United States obviously have a big relationship to Cuba, more probably Venezuela more so recently, but still a lot of Cuban artists will, if not go to Miami, will go to Mexico City, and that could be why you see some of that influence. So as we move towards the finish line, at least for class today, I just want to point out a few ideas here. This quote here by Soto says, the artists of the 1980s managed to change the course of art history in Cuba in spite of limited materials and access to information and political constraints and totalitarian control. And, all that is very meaningful and interesting. But I think, again, it's speaking in generalities. And the challenge for scholars and researchers, and maybe for you guys, is to go from these generalities and get these artists to maybe speak more specifically about, well, what was the nature of these constraints? Did you self-censor? Were there other people censoring you? Was it your art instructors who were censoring you? And what about totalitarian control? How does this relate to Antonia-itis, for instance? What kinds of subjects were off limits and what were safe? And I think it's debatable, but I think one thing to consider is whether or not Antonia-itis' experience really helped influence this whole wave of new artists after her shift into more conceptual art, while still trying to navigate the important theme of being relevant internationally, perhaps being more embracing embracing Cubanidad without being so like cha-cha-cha. With Fredo Lam had to navigate the same thing, making the jungle without making cha-cha-cha. And as we move forward into the late 80s and 90s, these artists, I think, challenge some of the status quo a little more, and they start shifting into into performance art and continue this embrace of conceptual art. But I think you see a rebirth of painting in the late 80s and especially into the 90s, because I think it becomes more safe to tackle controversial subject matter and even to be more critical of the government because of some of the changes we see in the late 1980s. Specifically, I refer to the fall of the Soviet Union and the Cuban government losing its main lifeline, economic lifeline. And so this is a big difference from this period. What we see in the 90s, a big change from the 80s. In the 1980s, the goal was to kind of offer this worthy Cuban alternative to maybe the artwork in the rest of the world, something that's uniquely Cuban, but still relevant and meaningful on a global stage. And in the 90s, what we see is the Cuban government suddenly shifts into 100% support of the arts, giving the artists the ability to leave the country and celebrating the arts, because bringing tourists to Cuba and anything valuable in Cuba is something that the government latches onto as a way to generate foreign investment, because Cuba in the 1990s is really thrust into a total state of economic calamity and desolation because the Soviet Union collapses. So the final artist we'll look at briefly, this artist Ruben Yorca, is another example of an artist who I think starts pushing that boundary to the point where he just sort of decides to leave and forget the boundary. I'll do art in Miami, safe from any kind of political oversight. And you see him experimenting with different techniques, and you'll see a lot of styles by artists in the 90s who play off on his style, and we'll see more of these artists because their legacy has a big impact on Cuban artists in the 90s. So this isn't the last we'll see of Yorka, but I think you can appreciate he's using kitsch, he's using recognizable objects, Santeria, maybe images associated maybe with tobacco and or Cuban history and or slavery. And I think he's combining all that familiarity into a potentially controversially, potentially politically loaded piece, but it's a lot safer to use these already kind of preordained cultural artifacts. By combining them all together, you have the totality of the safety of all these individually safe objects because they are part of the Cuban environment and not necessarily created by the artist as a challenge, which is maybe by definition more challenging to the status quo than if you just pick artifacts. I don't know if that makes sense what I'm trying to say about these. It's different than in the United States where you can take anything, newspaper clippings, Brillo, Campbell soup, and if anything, you're commenting on capitalism and consumerism. But if you do that in Cuba, you could comment on communism and be critical in a world where maybe you'd have less room for criticism. And I don't mean necessarily criticizing communism so much as maybe criticizing Cuba, but finding a way to be critical of Cuba while being relevant, while not losing your job. And none of these are the concerns that we have in the United States. You're not going to be forced into early retirement by painting a picture of someone at a podium. Maybe some other things might force you into early retirement, but you'd have to look at the context and the kind of triangulate why that might be in any given case. So something like this is a real, a little more conceptual, and he is using more politically loaded things like the flag and the bust of Martí. It looks like Martí, or what could be a very ubiquitous thing in Cuba, these marble busts of famous revolutionary leaders. And by covering it with the flag, he's pushing some major buttons here. It's one thing to use this hammer and the sickle. It's another thing to use the Cuban flag. And I think you could see these Cuban artists pushing those boundaries. But of course, you push the boundary too far and you go past that boundary and now you can't go back. And as you have read in your reading, the government has this unspoken law in Cuba that once you leave Cuba, you are erased. I need to add a quote, another quote here, and maybe cite the quotation. But that's a really, real goes a long way in explaining this idea of burning your boats, that Cuban artists in the 1980s burned their boats, which is to say the Cuban government, once you leave, they treat you as a pariah. You can't go back. And, I guess that's understandable if you benefit from all these years of education. If you take that education to another country, you've kind of blown their investment. That also goes a long way in explaining how different Cuba is in terms of travel. Cubans can't travel freely the way you do in the United States. And that's partly because socialism kind of requires a closed system, and everyone's equal. So you can't have the sort of privilege of leaving the country because you might just end up staying abroad. But that really is important for the next era because these Cuban artists coming after these artists from Volumen Uno recognize that if you burn your boats, you're going to lose a lot of your bankability, a lot of your marketability as a Cuban artist. Because if you're a Cuban artist in Miami, the art collectors are not as interested in you as if you're a Cuban artist in Cuba. And I think that's true for us too. I think we're a lot more interested in knowing about artists in Cuba responding to Cuba rather than an artist in Miami reacting to Miami, especially because Miami is such a detestable place in so many ways. God bless Miami. But I think a lot of people would agree it's overpriced, it's overdone, overblown, overhyped. And Miami is sort of fun for a few days and then you're broke and you want to go back home. So this painting itself is really, it can be awful in Miami. Yeah, I don't know if you're referring to Miami, but I think you are, Carrie. So even this painting, I think, is a very ironic reference to the Cuban art market. Time to buy Cuban art. And this woman showing her her sex. It's very kind of prostitution. Yeah, sorry, Carrie's from Miami, and I mean that, I'm from, Tampa and all of Florida suffers from the same problems, kind of this postmodern kind of Americana. And my parents grew up in Miami, or at least they met in Miami, or they got married around then. So Miami is wonderful in a lot of ways. You've got the three Miamis, Miami, and like Miami from New York. And I think in the last decade or so, Instagram has made it a destination for people to go on spring break, and it's probably ruined Miami for a lot of the people who live in Miami. But the Cuban artists who live in Miami definitely understand that there's a difference between being a Cuban artist in Miami versus being a Cuban artist in Cuba. So returning briefly back to Antonia Itis, I think you should consider looking more into her work, or seeing how these other Cuban artists relate back to her work. And I think it's really interesting to think about these other painters we see in the 90s who are artists, who are painters, who are many of them female, and they return to, and painting returned to relevance in Cuba in the 90s, perhaps because in one way, with a sort of this, the Cuban government understands that maybe there's the room for people like the vice president of the writers union to criticize these artists. You don't want guys like that. You don't want assholes, to be frank. You want assholes, pardon my French, to ruin the sort of this what's going on in the art scene. Although you could make the argument that his criticism of Itis also inadvertently led to this output of all these other artists. I think you don't want an environment of paranoia or censorship. And I think you'll see that the Cuban art world opens up to a degree as far as the government allowing for more self-expression, for one, at least, that is great, but also more political, sort of questioning the political status quo. Not absolutely, but, gradually, incrementally, pushing buttons, seeing what happens, like, what if I do this? What happens if I do this? And we will see some Cuban artists get thrown in jail for some of their more controversial acts. So it's not like they have total freedom to do whatever they want. We don't have too many photos from the Volumen Uno exhibit. I don't think you need to see the exhibit in order to really appreciate what's so unique about it, why it's so important for the history of Cuban art, but also as an alternative art movement to what we see by Warhol and Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, and other artists, even Ana Mendieta, Carl Andre, a lot of minimalism, but something, and very relevant to the world at large here. I think there's stuff by Monson, and also relevant to what we see coming later. And I think an important quote to kind of wrap up on is to point out this quote here by Fidel Castro, which is in this 1961 speech. He says, "First, art should be produced for the great exploited masses of people. And second, artists should have the future in mind." So these are his parameters for Cuban artists. And I think you could agree, or you might agree, that from this point of view, this group of artists from Volumen Uno, at least the second part of this, they have fulfilled the objective of Fidel Castro, because what we see coming up is the next generation of artists, and there's several generations in the late 80s, Alexis Novoa, and then in the 90s, the artists we see, they do very much benefit. They were fertilized by these artists from Volumen Uno. So I think they fulfilled Castro's objective here of being relevant to the future generation of artists. Now, this first part is maybe another question: should it be produced for the great exploited masses of the people? That's more complicated, and maybe just requires more time than we have left right now. But I think you could see that from this point of view, these artists are definitely within the revolution. Of course, it depends on how Fidel Castro defines a revolution and how all the revolutionary bureaucrats define it, because maybe one bad apple could ruin your career. So before we end, I just want to look very briefly inside the Museo de Bellas Artes, so you can see who's actually in the museo now, and you'll recognize some of the people. You'll recognize some of the artists we see here. Let's go a little further back. So here we are in Havana. It's so wonderful to see the beautiful bright light in Havana. And you can see some of the neoclassical architecture. It really resembles the Capitol building, building there in the back. And we are going into the Bellas Artes. And so I could see Pelaez, Amelia Pelaez, there's with Fredo Lam. Sorry, these aren't video hasn't loaded well, so it's a little blurry still. You can see that's the knife that we saw. And here, yeah, the Flavio Garciandia. So going back to what Dana was saying about Antonia Ides getting recognized by the Cuban government, I think likewise, they probably realized, oh, we need to put Garciandia's Zaida del Rio retrato here in the museum as a way to make amends for their more closed-mindedness in the early 80s. I think they've sort of they've walked back their attitude towards many of these artists in the 1970s. And so it's kind of like the MoMA in New York. It's a place where the Western world makes apologies for colonialism. Here in Cuba, the Museo de Bellas Artes is sort of a place where the Cuban government apologizes for the 1970s. And I think you recognize some of these artists, Raul Martinez there. It's nice to see it in scale. And also briefly, I just want to show you some more of Antonia Ides's paintings here. And then we'll wrap up. There we go. So you can see these are all works by Antonia Ides. So it's not just painting. You can even in the background there are these beautiful kind of examples of kind of concept art, found art, and so imaginative and so expressive. And I think it's that expressive quality that you see rear its head again in the 90s. I think one thing that a lot of these artists were avoiding, apart from maybe being too politically controversial, was being too expressive. And maybe there's something about individual expression that is maybe goes against the collectivist idea of communism. And I don't think that's an absolute truth so much as that the communist government in Cuba, late 20th century, has to understand that no, you do want individual expression in communism. All that does is benefit communism. It doesn't detract from it. And that's a fascinating thing to consider, is sort of the value of self-expression and whether that's within the revolution or outside the revolution. You could see all the men in the guayabara, the traditional Cuban shirt with the short sleeves, a great outfit to wear in a very hot, sultry environment like Cuba. And there's Ides, being honored for her contributions to Cuba. So, it's a good thing that Cuba honored her at the very end. And yet she probably missed a good 2 decades of, I don't want to say relevance, but, she definitely seemed to have been pushed off into the sidelines. And it would be so wonderful to kind of honor her legacy by interviewing some Cuban artists about her and about, of course, about these other artists too. So this is a great place to wrap up. I hope you read some of this reading Erased Rauschenberg before the next time we meet, and some of these other PDFs, because they're very relevant to what we're going to be learning. And we'll be shifting into the late 1980s with the likes of Glexis Novoa, who is an artist I interviewed, and I had a great interview with him. And so what we'll look at next class is some of how that interview relates to his encounter with Robert Rauschenberg, we looked at last week. And then we'll shift into the 1990s, the special period, and how the collapse of the Soviet Union impacts and dramatically impacts Cuban society in the 1990s. Any questions from anyone? If you need to go, class dismissed. If you want to stay, I'll stay here so you can ask any questions. Just a reminder to catch up on your reading. I'm not going to have you do any homework except to catch up on your reading and keep going ahead with your readings. And I'll post something in the next few days, a place where you can see more artists, more Cuban artists in the 90s and the 80s to consider as subjects for your final project. And contact me about the artists you pick, and then we'll go from there. And I think you'll find the rest of what we look at this semester to be as interesting as hopefully what you found interesting today. I personally find this to be the real highlight of this class, and I think you'll find it increasingly so as we move forward. So I'll say goodbye to everyone who leaves. Thank you for a great class as always, and I'll see you guys next class, which won't be next week, but I think the week after that. So I'll stay on board with any questions you guys might have for me.